Thanks to Card Market for sponsoring this video. Hi, I'm Marsh from StrataGames, and today we're going to be talking about how to build a Pauper Battlebox. But first, let's give a little bit of context. If you're interested in starting to play paper Pauper, the first thing you should do is check at your LGS if they already run any Pauper events, or just ask your friends and other people at the game store if they just own any Pauper decks. If there's already some form of organized Pauper play, then it's relatively simple to get started playing. You can just buy the cards for one Pauper deck and start attending that event. Or there's even a good likelihood that one or more of the players who already play in that event will be happy to loan a deck to you, which not only allows you to play the deck for free, but also allows you to try out several different decks before spending any money and committing to a deck that you're not sure if it's going to fit your playstyle. However, if there are no organized events at your LGS and no other players have Pauper decks already, then what do you do? Well, the easiest way to start playing Pauper from scratch is to build a Battlebox. A Battlebox is a set number of decks in the same format, for instance Pauper, that one player, you in this case, is going to assemble, allowing you and any number of friends to start playing Pauper without needing anything else. Think of it kind of like a board game. You invite 5 of your friends over to your house and then crack open the game box, and within are all the pieces that you need to start playing a fun and balanced game. The idea here is that you're lowering the barrier of entry for your friends to start playing with you. If you just say to all your friends, hey, we should start playing Pauper, and then you leave it to them to find a deck list, spend the money to buy the cards, and sleeve the deck, it's going to be a challenge to make sure that all of them actually follow through. But if you just set a deck down in front of them, chances are they'll pick it up and start playing with you immediately. A Battlebox can include any number of decks ranging from 2 to literally every deck in the format. But we're going to start small because the idea of a Battlebox is that you are starting with just a few decks and you want to curate a great experience for you and your players. So we're going to look at 2, 4, and 6 deck battle boxes, and I'm going to talk about the differences when building them. Now, the main reasons you might want to choose a 2, 4, or 6 deck battle box would be the number of players that you know you want to include. If you have maybe a commander pod, 4 of you total, and you want to start playing Pauper, then it's probably good to get 4 decks so that you can all play them at the same time. Or if you have 6 players, do that. But if you know you just have 1 player to play with, maybe starting with 2 decks is totally fine. The other thought is definitely budget concerns. Pauper is a very budget-friendly format. However, with it gaining a lot of popularity recently, some of the cards have gotten quite a bit more expensive, and it's no longer as easy as paying $20 to get a Pauper deck. Most of them are over $50, which is still a great price compared to Modern or Legacy, but definitely can hurt the bank a little bit for people who don't have a ton of cash on hand. But let's start with a 2-deck battle box. 2 decks is all you need to start playing, one for you and one for your opponent. But if you only have 2 decks, that means that every match you play will be the same matchup. Even if you and your opponent switch decks, one of you is going to be playing one deck against the exact same deck from the opponent. For this reason, it's imperative you choose 2 decks that are very balanced. If the matchup is really lopsided, then one deck is going to win a lot more often than the other, and whoever's playing the unfavored deck and losing a lot more often is very unlikely to continue wanting to play. Even if you and that player switch back and forth, whoever gets the weaker deck in the matchup is going to be pretty frustrated when they lose almost every time. Now, how do you make sure that the decks that you choose are well balanced? I suggest going to mtgdecks.net, which has a whole meta breakdown here. There's a link in the description, but we're also going to walk through it here. So this shows pretty much all of the decks in the format. These are the most popular decks by number of matches that have been played. This is taking into account all of the data from the last 6 months. You can shrink that quite a bit if you'd prefer, but I like getting as many matches as possible, though the meta does shift a lot through new sets and occasionally bans, so this might not always be 100% accurate to how the meta is currently today. Obviously, you can get a more up-to-date matchup data by doing the last 15 days. Then we can see that there's very few matches to account for with some of these. These are ordered by the number of matches that have been played, so the most popular decks are at the top here. This first column is the overall percentage win rate of that deck. Mono Red Madness has a 51% win rate against everything, so we can pretty much ignore this column here. And then the second box here, going in a diagonal pattern, is going to be your mirror matches. Mono Red Madness versus Mono Red Madness, Blue Terror versus Blue Terror. They're all going to be 50% because on one side of the match, a Blue Terror is winning, and on one side of the match, Blue Terror is losing. So unless you're planning on building 2 of the exact same deck, we can pretty much ignore this. If you are planning to do that, you can pick literally any 2 decks because it's always going to have a balanced matchup, but that's probably not the best way to get the most experience out of just your 2 decks. So then to the right of this diagonal line, you'll see a matchup, 42% for Grixis Affinity versus Elves, and you'll see the inverse of that if you go to the opposite side of the diagonal, 58% here, Elves versus Grixis Affinity. So what we want to look for here are matchups that are as close to 50% as possible. The first thing that we can do is easily rule out any of the matchups that are green or red, because these are favorable or extremely unfavorable matchups. So you don't want to play Mono Blue Terror against elves. That's going to be a bad matchup for the Terror player. All of the yellow boxes are between 40 and 54% win rate, which is still a pretty big gap, so I like to try to stay as close to 50% as possible. So we can find a matchup like here, 50% Jund Wildfire versus Mono Red Rally. 50% with over 115 matches. That seems like it might be a fair matchup that you can play. So you can just go here and look for 50% matchups, or 48 and 52, something that's pretty close to 50%, and find a matchup that speaks to you. I took the liberty of finding some pretty balanced matchups myself. Grixis Affinity versus Rakdos Madness, 50%. Jund Wildfire versus Red Rally, as I mentioned, 50. Golgari Food Pest versus Mono Red Madness, 50%. Again, Jund Wildfire versus Mono Blue Fairies. Even diverging a little bit from the exact 50%, Elves versus Dimir Terror, Blue Terror versus Gruul Ramp, White Weenie versus Coggates. All of these look like pretty balanced matchups. So if you just want two decks that are pretty popular in the format so that you and your players can learn some of the meta decks, I think that's totally great. But if you also just know a deck that you really like and want to pick that, we can start from that place too. Mono Black Sacrifice is my favorite deck, so let's go down to find that. It's not too far down, but it is definitely not one of the highest decks, Mono Black Sacrifice right here. And so now, if I know that I want this to be one of my two decks, I can just look along this line and see what are pretty balanced matchups. 52% here, we can track this back up, versus Elves. So maybe Elves is a decent matchup that we could pick. 49% versus Spy Combo, 52% versus Dimir Terror, 54% versus Coggates. I think just about any of these is going to be reasonable, although let's talk about Spy Combo. I do think, full transparency, I'm not the biggest combo fan. We're going to talk about combo when we get especially to the 6-deck battle box, but for a 2-deck battle box, I think you should avoid any combo decks. And the reason is because most combo decks are trying to get to their combo in Pauper between turns 4 and 6. That is their entire game plan. Some decks like Spy Combo and others have some sort of backup mid-range plan or something like that, but their number one game plan is to just go for their combo as quickly as possible. This means that any other deck that is incapable of racing them, which is really only the aggro decks, must drop whatever it's trying to do in order to stop the combo player. Now, in all Magic, there's a little bit of you trying to do your own game plan and also stop your opponent from doing their game plan. But the thing is, with a combo, if it goes off, the game is just over. So suddenly, the only important thing for the non-combo player to do is to interact and stop the combo player. So if I'm playing White Weenie, or I'm playing Jund Wildfire, or anything like that against Spy Combo, I'm not necessarily allowed to develop my game plan in the way that I want to. I have to start leaving up some sort of graveyard interaction really early on, otherwise I just might die on any given turn. This is a part of any meta, and there's nothing wrong with that, but if you're getting two decks, and suddenly one of those decks is almost never allowed to enact its game plan as it wants because it's always forced to stop your opponent, I think that will get a little bit tiresome. Black Sack's a bit of an outlier here because it is one of the few decks that is fast enough to race a Spy opponent, potentially being able to set up a turn 4 win itself. So maybe this is an okay one to have, but in my opinion, if you were to take two decks, you want two proactive decks that don't need to rely on stopping a combo super early in the game. If I were building a 2-deck battle box, Black Sack is what I would choose, and I would probably go with Elves or Dimir Terror. And Elves and Dimir Terror both have pretty reasonable matchups here. Elves does borderline on combo. It's kind of mid-range combo, and so maybe this has a little bit of what I was saying there, but it does also play a mid-range game, and Black Sack, again, can kind of race, so I think this would be a fine 2-deck battle box if you wanted to do that. So I think any of these is going to be pretty reasonable for you if that's what you want to do. Now, I already touched on budget a little bit. I was going to touch on budget a lot more here. If you're just trying to buy two decks and you want to keep it as cheap as possible, I was going to show you some very budget options. Unfortunately, decks have gotten a lot more expensive, so White Weenie is green here because it is probably the cheapest deck in the format, and one that I would suggest you go for if you are wanting to get a budget deck. Total, the deck is $60, $65, but here's the thing. Here we have my stock Leonardo White Weenie list. It's $66 on TCG Player, but 30 of those dollars are in 3 cards in the sideboard. This Dust to Dust, which exiles 2 artifacts from the board. This is a very good card and very important for the meta at large. But if you're building a battle box where this is mostly going to be playing against one other deck, you don't necessarily need Dust to Dust unless your opponent is going to be playing artifacts. If you choose to play White Weenie versus Affinity, you're gonna need this card. But if you choose to play White Weenie against almost anything else, Dust to Dust does not need to show up in your sideboard. You don't need to make an optimal sideboard for the entire format because you are curating your own little format. If you choose to do White Weenie versus Coggates, which is one of the matchups we pointed out, you don't need Dust to Dust at all. You can replace these cards not just with something cheaper, but with something that actually matters for that matchup if you want. The whole point of sideboards is to try to turn matchups that are not 50-50, maybe 60-40, into a 50-50 or even favored for you. A lot of red decks run a bunch of Pyroblasts because they're weak to blue decks, but then with all those Pyroblasts, you balance it out. We're already taking decks that are really well balanced, so we don't need the sideboard as much. I'm not saying don't build a sideboard at all for your deck, because sideboarding is an important skill to learn. I'm just saying don't spend a bunch of money on cards that are not going to get used in the sideboard for the 2 or even 4 decks that you're playing. Like I said, this would cut $30, almost half of the price off this deck. Suddenly it's $36, and it's actually pretty budget. Final tip on trying to assemble these decks on a bit more of a budget. These decks are made up of commons, so it's totally possible that you'll already have some of these cards lying around in your bulk boxes. Or your friends might have some cards lying around in their bulk boxes. You can check your LGS bulk bins. I've found tons of cards that are playable in Pauper there. And before you shop online, see if your LGS just sells the singles. They might have a slightly higher price, but first of all, you're supporting your LGS, and also you're not having to pay shipping, which is probably going to make up that price difference anyway. After you've done all of this, you might still need to buy some cards online, but chances are you'll buy fewer cards and save some money in the long run. So that's what you want to do for a 2-deck battle box. Now, what about a 4-deck battle box? If you have 4 friends, like we talked about, a commander pod maybe, you're trying to convert to play Pauper, you're going to need a few more decks. And you want to have a few decks so that you don't play the exact same matchup every time. Well, we're going to want to do roughly the same thing with our matchups, which is have close to 50% win rates. Now, this is a little tougher because suddenly you're not just doing 2 decks against each other, you're doing 4 decks against each other. So this data was all taken from MTG decks as well, and I pulled out 2 different grids of 4 decks that I think would make for good battle boxes. Of course, we have our mirror matches here, 50%, but Red Rally, Jund Wildfire, Jeskai Ephemerate, and Elves was the most balanced 4 decks that I could find across the entire format. The worst matchup for any of these would be Jeskai Ephemerate against Red Rally at 54%, which is still within 5% of 50, still really, really good, and not so far out of whack that you can't win some games and that people won't want to play that matchup. Even with 4 decks, it's really important that these decks are pretty well balanced, because if you always gravitate towards playing Red Rally, and then one of those decks has a 30% win rate against Red Rally, your opponent's never going to pick that one deck if you're playing Red Rally, and that means that you basically are just playing 3 decks. They only have 2 choices, and that's just not that enjoyable. That's not exactly what you're trying to do with 4 decks. You want them all to have good win rates against each other. So this is just a suggestion for 4 decks, but again, you could look at MTG decks, pick your own 4 that have pretty balanced win rates against each other. The other thing you want to look out for, I think with 2 decks, you pretty much just pick any decks that are balanced. It doesn't really matter. But with 4 decks, we want to start making sure that we're getting various archetypes in here. Red Rally is an aggro deck, Jund Wildfire is mid-range to control, Jeskai Ephemerate is just a full control deck, and Elves is somewhere between mid-range and combo. I still personally wouldn't want a full combo deck in just a 4-deck battle box, because again, I think it makes it so that all those other decks have to play a totally different game than they want to against that one deck. But if you have a friend who's only going to start playing if they can play a combo deck, then you could probably fit one in, but just try to make sure, again, those decks are all pretty well balanced. You also have a decent color spread here, getting at least one deck with every single color in it: mono red, mono green, black, red, green, and white, blue, red. This isn't the most important thing ever, but again, if you know your playgroup and you know someone is always going to want to play Counterspell or some sort of blue deck, you'll want to make sure you have one of those there. Or if you're trying to build a battle box so that you can get some more random people that you don't know as well at the game store to play, then it's definitely important to have a spread of colors, archetypes, and things like that, because if you bring all aggro decks and your opponent is a control player, they're not really going to have a good time doing that. Here's another spread of 4 decks that's a little bit less balanced, but still pretty decent. If you want another suggestion, Mono Red Madness, Grixis Affinity, White Weenie, and Dimir Terror. All of these are still within 10% of 50, but we do see that we have a few that are a little more skewed. Grixis Affinity has a pretty favored win rate against Dimir Terror, White Weenie against Grixis Affinity, and Dimir Terror against Mono Red Madness. I will say, even if there is a bit of a disparity here, most of these decks that are good against another deck are not all great against the same deck. If all of these greens were in the same column against Dimir Terror, then no one would ever want to play Dimir Terror. Now, Mono Red Madness, I will say, has 50% of course against itself, and then a below average win rate for all three of the other decks here. That might be something you want to avoid or at least keep in mind. I thought this was still an okay spread because Mono Red Madness is an extremely powerful deck that, even if it is unfavored, can often explode and still win games. And also might be one that's a little bit easier to play when first starting out, so it might have a higher win rate against players who are not as experienced. And again, here we have a bit of an archetype spread. White Weenie is aggro to mid-range, Grixis Affinity is mid-range, Dimir Terror is mid-range control, and Mono Red Madness is burn, control, combo, something along those lines. We might not have a full aggro deck here, so if you have a really aggressive player, White Weenie might satisfy them, but maybe you would want to go with something that has like Red Rally. And finally, getting into the 6-deck battle box. Here, I don't have exact decks that you would need to play. I don't have an exact grid because, as we saw, it's already hard to get 50% matchups against 4 decks. Once you branch out to 6 decks, there are going to be some lopsided matchups, and that's okay. Now, you still probably want to try to avoid a deck that loses 9 out of 10 times against another deck, and certainly you want to avoid having one deck that dominates all the other decks here. But I think as long as you have a good spread of colors and archetypes, you're bound to get some good matches here. So if I were building my ideal 6-deck battle box based on the decks that I like to play, aggro would probably be Black Sack. Aggro mid-range would probably be White Weenie. Mid-range deck would be maybe Esper Affinity. That's a favorite. Mid-range to control, probably Jund Wildfire. Control, probably Golgari Food Pestilence. And then combo, I'm not the biggest combo player, but if I were to fit something in here that kind of fits the rest, I think probably Spy combo would be decent. It's got some decent matchups, I think, here. We have some decks that have some inherent graveyard hate. Even the aggro deck can compete, but I don't think any of these are steamrolling any of the others. You don't have to follow this exactly. If it were me and I was playing with a bunch of other players like me that probably wouldn't want to play combo decks, I might swap this out for any of the rest of these. You know, throw in a Dimir Fairies or something like that. Or if you have a lot of combo players who enjoy that, maybe put 2 combo decks in here. That said, this would just be what's ideal for me. We have a lot of decks that are kind of this mid-rangey deck because that's what I enjoy, but you could try to get some more extremes as well. So maybe you want like a Hot Dogs deck, Kiln Fiend, Turbo Aggro. And these decks don't have to be meta either. I think generally getting a bit more meta decks is good for your battle box because then players can learn the meta, and if they start attracting more players who want to play meta decks, you're not starting from a place of having a bunch of off-meta decks. But the other thing is metas change very quickly, and so what I'm saying right now might not be extremely relevant in 3 months or 6 months or a year. But you could get Blue Fairies in here, Grixis Affinity, Dimir Terror. If you want to put a Turbo Fog in there, that's a hard control deck. And then your combo could be Tireless Tribe combo, something like that. The only thing I would say here is you probably want to try avoiding having very similar decks. So if you go Blue Terror and then Dimir Terror, you're getting a very similar flavor of deck there. There's nothing wrong with it, but you're limiting the breadth of decks that you could play a little bit. So having Mono Red Madness and Rakdos Madness, while different decks that play different cards, it might be a little similar. Same if you do like Walls combo and Spy combo, which generally uses a lot of walls. There's nothing wrong with this if this is what you want to do, but you're building 6 decks and actually only getting about 3 flavors of different decks. If you build a 2 or 4 deck battle box, I think what I said about sideboards is okay. You can build those sideboards for the battle box that you have, and you don't need to spend tons of money on the exact staples. Once you get to 6 decks, though, you are getting a much wider format, and your matchups are probably varying from 50%. I would say some of these matchups are probably closer to 60% for some of these things, and that's when you start needing those sideboard staples. So just keep in mind that as you get more and more decks, you'll not only be spending more money on those decks themselves, but you'll probably want to actually invest in those sideboard staples at some point. The last thing I want to say on this is that, as we talked about, this should be kind of like a board game, as in you have every piece that you need. That means you'll want to get the right tokens. Now, some decks might not make any tokens, and some might only make 1 or 2, and it's not the end of the world to have a face-down card that you say, okay, this is a 1/1 bird. But some tokens are extremely complicated. You are doing yourself and your players a disservice if you do not give them an Undercity token, or 2 if you're playing Avenging Hunter or other initiative cards in any of your decks. This is an absolutely absurd amount of information that is not stated on the Avenging Hunter card. All it says is you take the initiative. If they don't know what that means, that is going to be very frustrating and not something that you want to miss. Or even a deck that doesn't run initiative like Jund Wildfire that just has several different tokens, Blood, Clue, Eldrazi Spawn, Map. Your players will get confused if they have 8 different tokens that are all just the backs of Magic cards. This will get quite confusing. So make sure that you get the right tokens. Most people will just have these tokens lying around somewhere. You can probably get them for free, or even just buy them from your LGS. They'll probably have a bunch somewhere. Those are my suggestions for building 2, 4, and 6 deck battle boxes. You can of course go bigger. You can build 8 decks or 10 decks, but at some point it's less important to curate the exact experience because you just are bringing lots and lots of decks from the format. If you have a 10 deck battle box, that's totally great, but you probably don't need to put too much stock into what decks and specific archetypes and things like that, because you'll probably naturally hit a few different archetypes, a few different colors, and everything. If you do build 10 decks and realize every single one of them is an aggro deck, maybe branch out a little bit and try to build some other decks. But on the whole, you'll probably be fine if you just start picking some decks that you like. I hope this video was helpful. Thank you so much to my supporters. If you want to support me on a monthly basis, you can check my Metafy link down below, or you can join my channel memberships on YouTube to get early access to my videos. Thanks to my current $10 and up monthly supporters like Howard Granger, JDNPX, Halkaz, Cody Cowell, Sty, DJ Vinyl, and In Bunsui Bust. I really appreciate the support, and I will see you all next time.